DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/firstpawmedia.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
From First Paw Media, sponsored by Alaska Dog Works Professional Canine Training Center in Anchorage, Alaska. This is DogWorks Radio, committed to families and their dogs to build lifelong and fulfilling relationships. Visit our website at dogworksradio.com. Now here are your hosts, Robert and Michelle Forto.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto and you're listening to DogWorks Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Be sure to check us out on social media, just searching DogWorks Radio. And today I have on a guest. He is also a fellow podcaster. His name is James Jacobson, and he is calling in from the beautiful Maui, Hawaii. James, how's it going today?
Aloha. It is great to be with you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, James. Our focus today for our listeners is to get a really good background about what you're doing, some projects you're working on, of course, talk about your podcast, how long you've been doing this, and just kind of pick your brain on some of these topics that I'm sure a lot of our listeners will enjoy. So let's start this off, James. Can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you're all about, please?
Well, as you say, I am James Jacobson. I am the founder of Dog Podcast Network, which is a network for dog lovers of all types. And I have been in the dog business for, oh my gosh, so long, since well before 2003 when I thought I had gotten into it. But I have written books. I own a publishing company. We publish books. I've been involved in a dog supplement company that I helped to co-found, and then this is my latest venture. So my life has gone to the dogs many years ago, but I love them so much.
In your bio, James, on your website, you have a very interesting path to get where you're at today, and it's very similar to mine. You mentioned that you were longing for a puppy when you were a kid, and instead your parents gave you I believe it's a small handheld recorder or something. I received one of the same things, but I think I got a dog at about the same time. But that sort of led you down the path to where we are today. I know you've had a long career in media as well as working with dogs, but growing up, tell us about your experience with dogs. What was your first one? What was his or her name, if you can remember? And what made that pet so special?
Well, my first dog probably came when I was 4 or 5, named Bobo. It was a stuffed animal, and I loved it so much because, and then this is going to sound like, oh my gosh, get the psychologist out. But I love that dog so much because I knew that I wanted a real dog, and I told my parents that, and they said, well, when you turn 10, you will get a dog. And so, Robert, when you make a promise to a kid, they remember it. And so every year at my birthday, I was like, okay, one more year, 2 more. And then finally it came time for my birthday, and I came down to breakfast, and there was a box sitting on the dining room table. I was really excited, also kind of wondering why the dog is so quiet. And then inside the box, I opened it up, and it is a Panasonic tape recorder. I never got a dog until many years later, after college. I was in my 20s. I was living with a girl in Virginia, and we ended up getting I knew I wanted a Jack Russell Terrier. We ended up getting a Maltese, and I loved that dog. And I basically started my love for Maltese and for dogs in general.
Yep, definitely a similar path for sure. So let's talk a little bit about that tape recorder. Of course, we're doing the newfangled way of recording on tape, as they still say in the business. What did you do with that bad boy? Did you have a microphone that you carried around interviewing your family and friends and the whole 9 yards?
I did. Oh my gosh, yes. I had that. I would interview people. I would ask all sorts of questions. I was an intrepid reporter, and I also started to be really interested in the medium of radio. I love that this is on radio because, I mean, I loved radio. I was an only child. I grew up doing DXing, which is when you would listen to AM stations as far away as possible. I was growing up in Wilmington, Delaware, and I would try to get stations. I think I even got some stations in Alaska. I mean, Canada. I would just love the medium of radio. And when I was 12 or 13, I entered a playwriting contest, a children's radio theater playwriting contest, and was one of the winners. And that show actually ended up getting a Peabody Award and an A.I. DuPont Award. So it's crazy. As just a little kid, I won I was part of the team that won this the highest broadcasting award. That are in the profession.
You know, James, when I was growing up, it was either a combination of golden oldies, as my father used to call them, or talk radio, as we would travel the country each summer, to Disney World or wherever, with us kids in the back, having to shut up back in the days. We could not act foolish in the car back in the 70s and 80s. But I really loved listening to talk radio, as you said that you did, and that's sort of how I formed my path to get involved with podcasting. I got involved a little bit later than you did, but you had several ventures under your belt before you jumped into the realm of podcasting. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
Sure. It sounds like we really are kindred spirits. This is so cool. Because you don't see a lot of kids. I mean, we grew up in the same era, and you don't see a lot of kids who were like, listen to talk radio. They were all like, rock and roll over it. But yeah, I've been a dyed-in-the-wool entrepreneur my entire career. When I was in college, I did radio, of course, and I started a television production company. And when I graduated, I raised money from the then wealthiest person in the United States to buy a radio station when I was 22 years old or whatever. And didn't end up doing it, came hours away from doing it, learned a lot about business and ethics and stuff like that, and ended up working for a short while for Westwood One NBC Radio. And then that was pretty much the last job I ever had working for anyone else. I started building my own businesses and have been doing that ever since for quite a number of years. I've done things in the video production world. I've done things in the publishing world. I was an early .comer in the go-go days of the 1999, early 2000s. So I've done a lot of different things, and then podcasting is just a natural extension of that.
So if I remember correctly, when I spoke to you on your show, I think you mentioned that in the early 2000s, you were contemplating moving over to Hawaii, and you were commuting back and forth to, I believe, New York City. Is that correct?
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. So about an
I used to commute between the two.
A little 8 or 9 hour commute every week is nothing to sneeze at, is it?
No, it was 12 hours door to door from Alexandria, Virginia to where I was living here in Maui. And it was a pain in the butt because I was at that time actually, the reason I was doing it is I had a media company in Washington, and I was also trying to build a media company here in Hawaii, a different type of media company, and it required being in both places. And I can't lie, I loved being in Hawaii a lot more than being in DC.
Yeah, I grew up in that area, learned how to drive on the DC Beltway, and I tell you what, it's an experience for a teenager for sure. So during this time, James, you were doing a bunch of things, as you mentioned, but you're also working in canine health, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about your podcast and your podcast network. But what was the focus of that point in your career, and how did that influence what you do today with your podcast?
Well, so when I moved, for many years I've been commuting between DC and Maui, and then in 2003 I decided, after 72 trips, I decided to move here full time. In order to do that, I had to help change the laws because I had a little dog, a Maltese named Maui, and I said, okay, I got to bring her to Hawaii, but I will not put her in quarantine, which had been a law that had been in the book longer than the state of Hawaii had been a state, because it was designed to prevent rabies from being introduced here. So I got together with a bunch of other people, and we helped to change the law, which was kind of a big deal. So as soon as the governor signed that, I moved to Maui with my dog Maui, and then I got here and I said, what am I going to do? I'm kind of, I would throw around the word retired, but I wasn't really retired. But I was like, what am I going to do? And I didn't know exactly what to do. And I said, well, I will write a book. And I decided to write a book about something that was near and dear to my heart. And it was called How to Meditate with Your Dog. And it's something that I had been doing my whole life with dogs. And prior to that, I'd just been a meditator, but I found it as an interesting way to introduce people to the practice of sitting, of meditation. Because I think if everyone does that, the world will be a better place if we're a little bit more conscious by taking a few minutes every day and meditating. So I wrote that book. It became a bestseller. I did the whole media tour. I was on CNN. I was on Jay Leno. I flew in Oprah's jet. I did a whole bunch of things to promote that book. And that we did one of the first viral videos ever for dog lovers. And that basically built this big email list. And then everything has come from that very silly but important book.
Yeah, and of course, that can easily lead into a podcast. And for folks that are listening, there are a heck of a lot of podcasters that are also authors, or vice versa. They use both of those platforms to promote their brand, and it's usually pretty effective that way. So, James, did you take that information and experience that you gained on this whirlwind media tour and, the process of sitting down and writing a book and developing stories and all of that, sort of as a gateway to your podcasting career that you're involved with now?
I guess so. I wasn't as conscious as that, but certainly everything in my life is cumulative, and I guess has led to the place where I'm at now with Dog Podcast Network. So it wasn't conscious, but it was definitely there, and obviously telling good dog stories and looking for connecting with people who love dogs as opposed to own dogs, people who consider dogs part of the family, which has always been my focus. And that probably evolved in the process of writing and promoting How to Meditate with Your Dog.
So let's talk about the Dog Podcast Network. Of course, here we are talking on a dog podcast, and you and I are kind of cut from the same cloth, at least in our direction that we try to go to.
It sounds like, especially since we grew up driving on the Beltway. That says a lot, Robert.
As they say, a brother from another mother. So I don't know. Maybe we
I love it.
Maybe we crossed paths once or twice. We just didn't know it. So anyway, back to the development of the podcast and where it stands today. We were talking right before air about there's not a lot of dog podcasts out there that provide really good information on particular topics. There's a lot of, one topic type podcasts, whether they're talking about working dogs or, just dog training in general, but there's not sort of what I like to call a story-based or even a news-based podcast, and that's something that you're heavily involved in on one of your shows. I believe that's your flagship or your kind of your heading show, which is where you do kind of delve into those informative topics like dogs in the news and particular stories. Is that right?
That's right. The name of the show is Dog Edition, dogedition.com. And it is just, as you say, it's a news show. We think of ourselves as journalists who do things that are dog adjacent. So pretty much any news story can have a dog angle if you look at it from that perspective. So whether you're talking about the environment or politics or just about anything, it can have an interesting dog angle. And that's what Dog Edition is. And we have a team of journalists. I'm in Hawaii, and you know this, being in Alaska, you pull from a distributed team. So we have people who are in California and Asia and Australia and Europe, and we've pulled these amazingly talented journalists together to create this weekly show at this point. And it's supposed to sound a little bit like, I don't know, All Things Considered or Morning Edition for dog lovers. It's a magazine formatted show where we tell 2 or 3 stories in a hopefully a fun show that you can listen to while you walk around the block with your dog.
Yeah, it's a great show. I had the pleasure of being on a couple of months ago, and I've listened to many of them before and after, and I really enjoy your topics, your interviews, your stories, and whatnot. So, James, you've been involved in a lot of different types of media. You've written books, you've been on talk radio, you've developed marketing companies, etc. I don't know exactly what your demographic is, but ours is the typical middle-aged female. That's our listening audience on our podcast. But as you know today, the media is pretty split, and it's really age specific. So, the younger crew are listening to or watching YouTubes and TikToks and Instagram and all of that, whereas the older folks are still listening to the radio and, text-based things where there's reading or magazines or whatever. So my big question to you is, with all of this in your background, why did you choose a podcast over something else?
I love the medium of audio. I think that the intimacy that you get where you can listen to something in your car or while you're exercising is really cool. And I love radio, but what I love about podcasting is that it's on demand. So, we go back to the days pre-TiVo where, you'd have to be home to watch the event when it was on television. If you missed it, you missed it. And then, TiVo and DVRs came out and changed all that with time shifting. And that's really what podcast enables us to do, is you get to hear what you want to hear when you want to hear it. And so it marries those two things of the intimacy of the audio medium where radio is the theater of the mind. I think that was Orson Welles. And the ability to time shift things so you can hear them when you want. So that's why I like podcasting a lot.
Jim, I'm sure you've been to podcast movement at least a couple of times in your career as a podcaster. And as you know, there is a real growth in the movement about folks that are trying to come out with podcasts and develop their own story and, of course, make it big, as they say, in the business with monetization and all of that. But they often promote, in particular, the research portion of podcasting, that podcasting is going to be one of those mediums that's here to stay. What are you doing in terms of a long-range plan to make sure that your medium and your message continues to be heard by the dog ownership masses, if you will?
Well, that's a really, really good question, Robert. I think that while I love the medium of podcasting, it's just a way to get a message out. So one of my mentors early on said, if a customer wants something, you should take Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, check, cash, whatever. You should make it easy for a customer to pay you. Well, the equivalency with podcasting and media today is to be able to make the content available in whatever format people want. So it can be an audio podcast. All of our shows also are on YouTube, and we turn them into, we actually spent quite a bit of time converting them into what we call bouncing ball videos, where you can listen to the podcast, but you can actually read along because you have a verbatim transcript, and it's kind of intoxicating. We will be doing more and more in video because I have a television background. But then, we put focus on show notes and the content and blog, and basically give people access to the content in whatever format they want it. So that's our approach at this point. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Jim, in just the last few minutes we have together, I definitely want to touch on some of your other shows and projects that you're working on. You mentioned that Dog Edition is sort of that flagship show on your network, but you also do some other things, and in particular, a show on canine cancer. What got you involved with that topic? And as you know, that touches a heck of a lot of dog owners, in their journey with their pets. It affects a lot of us, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yeah. Cancer is the number one killer of dogs. 1 in 3 dogs dies of cancer. And if you have a dog who reaches the age of 10, the odds are 50-50. And in certain breeds and ages, you're going to have like 75% who are going to die of cancer. So it's unfortunately way too many people. So the podcast that you're talking about is called Dog Cancer Answers. It's actually the first podcast we ever did. It was the genesis in many ways of Dog Podcast Network. And it is a podcast designed for you to listen to if you have a dog with cancer, where we provide all sorts of answers to all sorts of very in-depth topics. There's broad things like, what should I do diet-wise, and then very specific deep dives where we have a team of veterinarians will go deep into a specific type of cancer or even a treatment for a specific type of cancer. And we take answers or questions and we provide answers from our listeners. And Dog Cancer Answers came out as an adjunct to a book that we publish. One of my companies, Maui Media, publishes, called the Dog Cancer Survival Guide, which is actually the number one best-selling animal health book in the English language, and it has been for years because, unfortunately, cancer is so big. So it's one of those shows they say, I'm really sorry you have to listen to Dog Cancer Answers, because if you're listening to this, you probably have a dog with cancer, and we all know that sucks, but getting the information and being part of our community, because we have an online Facebook community for that, is really important. So, yeah, that's one of the shows that is just really done as a way of helping dog lovers.
So speaking of doing your research and writing books and whatnot, for folks that may not know, cancer is literally just mutated or modified cells that are already in the system, and they mutate in some way that causes ill effects. I guess my question to you, and sort of a takeaway from this, is what is one or two things that a person can do to either modify this journey or somehow inhibit it? Is it diet? Is it breed specific? What is that one marker that seems to be the thing that causes this downfall in most dogs?
Well, if I had the answer to that,
it would be. I don't know if it would be the Nobel Prize, wouldn't it?
That's the Holy Grail. That is the Holy Grail. Because cancer isn't just caused by one thing; it's a whole host of things. And diet is really important, as are environmental toxins, as are breeding. So if you keep breeding, the reason that cancer is so prevalent in golden retrievers, like 60% of golden retrievers have cancer, die of cancer. And so we just did a show both on a little segment appeared on Dog Edition, and then the longer conversation appeared on Dog Cancer Answers with the Morris Animal Foundation that's doing this lifetime golden retriever study where they have 3,000 plus dogs that they study from puppies all the way till they're dead. to look at what are the commonalities and what, why some dogs don't get cancer and why so many do. And it's lifestyle, it's diet, it's environmental, it's genetics in terms of like constantly breeding the same, gene pool. There's so many factors.
Yeah, there are. And I just want to stay on this for one more moment, James, before we go.
Yeah.
But in your work and in your interviews, do you find that most people out there take an approach towards treatment for their dogs, or do they do something different? Sort of let their dogs live out their days, as they say. What is the current model in what folks are doing with their pets?
That's also a really good question. And it depends on how one defines treatment. So obviously there's quote unquote standard of care, what a veterinarian would call it, which is, chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. Those are the three things that from a veterinary perspective are standard of care. But it's also really expensive. It's between $5,000 and $8,000 on average if you pursue that. So a lot of people, when they have a dog cancer diagnosis, have to go through an exercise that we talk about in the book, Dr. Dressler's book, The Dog Cancer Survival Guide, that you kind of look at all of the options, which first starts with knowing what kind of person you are. Are you the kind of person who wants to give your dog every medical treatment, or do you care more about quality of life? So some people will opt for quality of life, which means focusing on diet and focusing on making the dog happy and comfortable. And there's so many factors that go into that, like what type of cancer does the dog have, and what stage is it at, and how old is the dog, and what is the expected life expectancy for the dog if, he didn't have cancer. And there are just so many things to factor in. But those are the types of questions that I think are really good, and they define what is, in effect, treatment.
I tell folks all the time, James, to develop that relationship with your veterinarian as you would your own family physician. They can be real advocates for that journey that we have with our dogs, and I think it's one of the most important relationships that a pet owner can have. I'm sure you agree with that.
I totally agree. It's so important. I mean, we know that a lot of people who are dog lovers are more likely to take their dog to the veterinarian than to take themselves to the doctor if they're sick. So having that reliable veterinarian that you can trust and really be part of your team is important. And how do you like fire a vet? How do you like go about like maybe that there's not a great fit, but you need to know the questions to ask so that you can make sure that you do have a veterinarian who is a real trusted advisor. That's really good advice.
Good stuff for sure. James, anything else you want to mention? Any projects you're working on, upcoming stories or podcast, or anything of the such that you would like to say before we go?
Well, I hope people do check out Dog Edition and Dog Cancer Answers. We have another show called The Long Leash. All of that's on dogpodcastnetwork.com. We have some cool. I just did an interview a couple weeks ago that just aired last week with Dean Koontz, who is a massive dog lover, in addition to being, having sold, 500, no exaggeration, 500 million books. So we get to talk to some really cool people about their passion for dogs, and I hope your listeners will give it a listen and see if they like it.
All right, James, I ask a question on our podcast to most of our guests, mainly on our mushing show, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and ask you that question as well. And that is, if a person were to come up to you and they're looking to add a dog to their family for the first time in their lives, and age isn't a specific marker here, but what would be one piece of advice that you would give that person if they asked?
Do you want a new member of your family? Do you think adding same considerations parents would have if they decide like, okay, we're gonna go for a baby right now? Is this a commitment that you are looking at as, this is kind of big, it will make my family bigger, but I'm willing to do all the sacrifices and get up in the middle of the night and feed and do all the things that you do with the baby? Is that where you're at, or are you just looking for, something cute that is just a nice little thing that you may not really want to commit to for 15 years.
Yeah, great advice. That is a long commitment, and I think the statistics show that often it is a longer commitment than a lot of marriages. Isn't that right?
They are. Yeah, there's this whole thing about, actually, we're doing a story on pup nuptials. Before you get married, there's prenup, but there's also pup nuptials. Who's going to get the dog? I was just talking to a colleague today who's a podcaster who's splitting up with his girlfriend, and like, who's going to take the dog? So yeah, these commitments to a dog are definitely can be longer than the commitments to your partner.
All right, James, before we go here, how can folks follow you? We mentioned how we can follow the podcast, but how can folks follow you and follow your trials and tribulations about life on Hawaii, your pet journeys, and all of that?
Well, I am on all the socials. I'm not the best, but I am on all the socials at my name, James Jacobson. So, and Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at James Jacobson, Jacobson. And I do read the stuff, and I'd love to hear from people.
Excellent. James Jacobson is our guest today, and he lists himself as the chief visionary of Dog Podcast Network. We'll be sure to post links in our show notes to everyone that is listening. James, it was my pleasure. I'm glad we took the time to be on each other's podcast, and I look forward to keeping this relationship going in the future.
Me too, Robert. Again, cutting your teeth on the Beltway in D.C. and loving dogs and doing radio and podcasts about them. We have a lot in common. Hey, we live in the 49th and 50th state, so that's cool too.
That is cool for sure. Very good, guys. Again, James Jacobson, dogpodcastnetwork.com. Check it out. I'm sure it's on all of the podcast platforms, wherever you're listening right now. On behalf of my guest, this is Robert Forto for DogWorks Radio. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From First Paw Media, this is DogWorks Radio. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Robert and Michelle Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto and created for First Paw Media. Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.